All right, if I could, yeah, just let me just get everybody to, huh? What?
I'm gonna finish watching.
Are you telling me or asking me?
I'm asking. Can I finish?
Yes, go ahead. Yes, go ahead. Big English test?
Yeah.
Okay. Well.
Decent size.
All right, let me get everybody to settle, and we'll give Erin our undivided attention. All right, Erin, whenever you are ready to begin.
Just because many people possessing drugs is the best way to kill addiction. The war on drugs have been around for decades, and what has come of it? Drug use is still a large problem. Perhaps there's time to look at a different solution, which is why I'm proposing that we medicalize drug addiction. So, basically, drugs work by giving, taking them heightened levels of dopamine in a very short amount of time. And over time, people get used to this high, which makes things like once given natural dopamine boost a lot less effective. Drugs have a behavioral effect in how drug addicts are often portrayed as being. In the past, before prohibition in America, addicts were seen or often more sedated as a result of the addiction, not more aggressive, and they would really do anything criminal. In fact, three-quarters of self-described addicts had steady, respectable jobs and physical effect of addiction. A lot of people believe that addiction and physical dependence are one and the same. That's not true. Just because somebody is addicted to a drug does not mean that they need the drug in order to feel physically well. So what causes addiction? One of the first major causes is genetics, which can account between 40 and 60% of someone's physical addiction. Another main cause is age, in which adolescents are a lot more likely to become addicted than adults are. However, the largest factor of addiction is the environment. So this is best seen in the rat park experiment. In the past, in order to see if drugs cause addiction, scientists would put a rat in a cage, and they would give the rat a choice between two types of water. One was just regular pure water, and the other was laced with a drug. And every single time, the rat would always choose the drug water and drink it until it overdosed and died. Which would prove that that drugs cause addiction. However, to get a better view on addiction and what causes addiction, Bruce Alexander, a professor of psychology at Simon Fraser University, created the rat park experiment. In this experiment, he had the same cages. He had two different types of cages. He had the same cage used in the previously mentioned experiment, just to isolate rats in the two different types of water. But he also had another type of cage called a happy cage. And inside that cage, the rats had a bunch of other rats to play with, toys, and everything a rat could want. So the hypothesis was that if drugs cause addiction, then rats in both cages would both experience addiction and both use large amounts of drugs. However, this wasn't the case. The rats that in the isolated cages would drink up to 25 milligrams of morphine a day, while the rats in the happy cages would use barely any and spend the time doing other things. And the impact of impairment is exemplified in this experiment as the rats that were originally placed in the isolated cages, once they were placed inside the happy cages, they would quickly stop using drugs. So this experiment shows that the environment has the ability to either make or break somebody's addiction. So drug addiction is found in people who are desperate for social bonds and are miserable. They take drugs to numb the pain. However, the subculture of the drug addicted criminals that's often portrayed is still very real and prevalent. But it gives these people a miserable experience. They face threats like being killed by the substances they're taking, rape, and the rest. Drugs are used to escape misery. However, these people engage in a community that would make anyone miserable. These communities didn't break even at times where they couldn't get heroin, as Alexander, the man who made the drug park experiment, saw with the addicts that he was working with. he saw that even when there was a drug famine, these addicts still participated in the same addict behavior. They even injected empty powders in their arms. But why did this happen? Well, it turns out that drugs can indirectly provide much more than just suppression. With the prohibition of drugs, a subculture of crime was born. So this phenomenon kind of shows what was wrong with the original VAT party experiment. It was just as if VAT having two different choices of drug water. See, the VAT either had the drug water or they had nothing at all. These people are faced with the same choice. They either have drugs in the community that comes along with drugs, or they have nothing at all. When Alexander, I asked these people why they kept engaging in this community, they told him what else would they do? They could go work a minimum wage job and then sit down and watch TV all day. As Alexander says, it's a lot better to be a junkie than nothing at all. And this is the choice that people have to choose. This is the choice that these people are faced with. They could either be a junkie or nothing at all. While they should be punished for the crimes they commit, they shouldn't be punished for their addiction. These people are socially desperate enough to seek belonging in the most dangerous places. They shouldn't be isolated from the rest of society and be expected to recover from their addiction. So, medicalization has a lot of good effects. So with all of this in mind, we should look at medicalization as a solution, as it won't result in, because it doesn't require us further isolating these already very broken people. So medicalization can have good effects on society. It decreases the amount of drug-related deaths as seen in Portugal. After they decriminalized all drugs, the drug-related death rate plummeted to 5 times lower than the European Union average and stands at 1/5 of the United States. And it also can lead to a decrease of crime. In Northern England in the 1990s, there was a hospital created by a man named John Marks, in which he would give addicts enough heroin and cocaine to last a week, and he would give them that every week. And about 18 months after this hospital was started, there was a 93% drop in theft. While medicalization isn't a perfect solution, it could lead to an increase of experimental drug use, as seen in Portugal. However, Portugal was only decriminalized it. Medicalizing it would put drugs in the hands of doctors and making it available through prescription only, which will hopefully make this effect hopefully make this increase very small or non-existent. But it can also lead to a decrease in drug use, which sounds really odd because that doesn't make sense at first glance. However, addiction is a very expensive habit to have. So what addicts usually end up doing is that they buy drugs and they take what they need, and then they end up selling the rest, and then use the profit made off the drugs they sell to buy more drugs. And in order to sell drugs, you have to have a customer, and through this, addicts become expert salespeople. That's leading to an increase in drug use. Also, finally, medicalization can decrease the chance for minors to get drugs. Right now, unlike with alcohol, no one will sell a minor alcohol because they can risk losing their license as a result. So minors will usually resort to turning to drug dealers because they don't have an incentive to not sell minors drugs. They're already breaking the law. What's having minors going to do to them? Medicalization also helps people with addiction. One of the as seen in the hospital I mentioned, even though a lot of the patients came in with a criminal record, after the treatment they became good law-abiding people because they no longer needed to. This happened because when they're given access to drugs and are able to afford it because it provided for insurance or given to them. They don't need to get a lot of money really quickly, which means they don't have to turn to crime like theft and drug dealing. Physical health also improves a lot with medicalization. A lot of people who entered this hospital came in with wounds like these, and came in with HIV and illnesses like that. And a lot of people think that the drugs themselves would cause these types of wounds. However, that's not the case. As I mentioned earlier, addicts have to sell drugs once you get more drugs, usually. So what usually ends up happening is that they mix the drugs they're selling with things like concrete powder, crushed crystals, and chalk. And these are the substances they end up injecting into the body that's creating these types of these types of wounds. And so whenever we give addicts medically cured drugs along with like clean needles, these types of wounds and HIV won't spread. And there's this phenomenon called natural tethery, but basically after some time, an addict will just stop using. So after many years of addiction, the addict will just eventually just stop using the drug, regardless if they get treatment or not. So the point of medicalization is keeping the addict safe and stabilized at the point where they can reach natural recovery. So as far as incarceration just doesn't work. We can see that imprisonment doesn't really have much of an effect on drug use. As you can see with Tennessee, that has a much higher drug imprisonment rate than New Jersey does. So if imprisonment did work, then that would mean that Tennessee would have a much lower drug use rate than New Jersey does. But that isn't the case. It don't seem to be correlated at all. Next is that it has a very small impact on communities, as most of the time people being arrested for drug-related crimes are the low-level drug dealers who get replaced really quickly, that's making their effect nullified. But what's even worse is whenever somebody higher up in the crime hierarchy or gang hierarchy gets arrested, because now there's an open spot, and there's a vacant spot, and people will fight each other for the chance to get the power to climb up in the gang hierarchy, which leads to like an increase in homicide in those communities. Why Christians should care? Well, Christians are called to be kind and compassionate and forgiving to each other. So this kindness needs to extend to addicts too, because they're also part of humans, a part of us. Christians should not be judgmental towards addicts because we are also sinners. Christians rely solely on God's forgiveness because we are dead in our sin. We need to extend the same grace to addicts. And Christ came to help sinners. If God can come from heaven to help sinners, then surely Christians can travel a few blocks to help addicts too. Finally, the church has the ability to solve the largest factor of addiction, environment. Addicts are so desperate for a community that they're willing to travel to the darkest places to find one. They shouldn't have to do that. Christians should welcome them into the church and actively help them. Considering that historically Christians have supported prohibition, and with the drugs being criminalized, addicts are scared to ask for help because that could ultimately end in their arrest. With medicalization of drugs, addicts will become less afraid to reach out for help. Addicts should be accepted into society instead of isolated in prison like a rat in a cage. That's all.
All right, thank you, Erin. Our guests, I want to open up to you first. If you have any questions or comments for Erin.
Really deep subject. So you use the term medicalization. I apologize, I'm ignorant on most things. Are you referring to legalization but under the control of the physician?
Yes. Like if it's making drugs available through prescription.
Were you thinking of more, what would they call it, recreational drugs in your research?
Mm-hmm.
Cocaine, marijuana, heroin, things like that.
So, a couple questions. with this idea that, okay, so you have someone who's addicted to an illicit substance, not, okay, let me start with this question since it's coming to mind. We have a severe problem in our country with addiction to drugs, but they're fairly legitimate drugs such as opioids, painkillers. You know, these aren't like hallucinogenic, whatever. They're just, these are legitimate drugs that are used for all sorts of medical purposes that are already regulated, that are already, so you're only supposed to be able to get them through prescription, and yet we have a very intense problem with addiction to those drugs. I hear you when you want to reach out to addicts and help them with their addiction to these substances, but it seems like if we already have a problem with the prescription drugs, with addiction to prescription drugs, making those prescription drugs, I'm having a hard time forming my question without saying, why is it not going to be the same problem? Does that make sense?
Yeah, good question. So, I think like right now with criminalizing, like we already had criminalization things without like way more problems than legalizing. But then then people who are addicted to opioids have, like, there's no gang violence over opioids. There's no, like, people aren't getting abscesses from taking opioids. So this is just like a first step, really. And like drug addiction is fighting all these like major issues. Like I have like a lot more on gang violence that I read a lot more in detail. My research I can't go into detail here. And legalizing illegal drugs is like, kind of the first step. Doesn't mean like right now, the system we have now is definitely not perfect, but we can maybe like from what I've seen, like people who are addicted to these illegal substances often get better. And I think now, like in America, we have like more like a focus on mental health. I think, sorry, into this like,
no, you're doing fine.
It's like medicalizing is more like the step one. Like fixing the opioid epidemic is like a whole other nuanced, like complex issue, and I don't really know how to solve that. I just know that through making them criminalized, we have many larger problems. Like we get to address the same ones from like opioids and like these ones get. That makes sense.
That's a really good answer. No, like so you're basically saying like it's the criminalization part that is so terrifying to someone who's addicted to these illicit or recreational substances and so on, whereas opioids, it doesn't come with as many addiction is a problem no matter what you're addicted to, right? But
alcoholism, like it's all like addiction is like a massive problem and experience other many different types of substances. Even like most things like films too. Like addiction is like a very complex problem, and I don't know how to solve it.
But what you're wanting to do,
criminalization is just a failure all around. Criminalization, I like to be the first step to beginning to solve it.
Gotcha. Very good answer. Yeah. Anything else going on? I got a couple more over here, but I don't want to interrupt.
I got one.
Hang on just a second. Go ahead.
No, you take priority. Go ahead.
Well, that's a really interesting subject. So if you end up making, I'll pick a subject, cocaine medicalized, and you'd have to make it where the trip to the doctor and the cost of the drug were almost free because you're competing against illegal options, right? But if you did that, then in a way you bankrupt the dealers.
Exactly.
Over time.
Yes.
Over time.
Yes, that is a good point. So like, say like during Prohibition, during like, I can't remember which one it was, but like during Prohibition of alcohol, there was like gang violence came about, and the same thing is happening with drugs. Like gang violence is caused by drugs, and thinking about drugs, that is a very lucrative industry, and we are giving gangs like a full monopoly over it. So by like breaking the monopoly, by giving it to pharmacists and doctors, we're going to like triple the main source of income, and do that, which should make communities a lot safer. And it should be very easy to convince addicts to go to doctors instead. I mean, they have clean versions of the drugs, probably covered by insurance, and with like drug dealers and gangs, the prices are artificially inflated because they had to bring it in through illegal means, and there's also no one regulating prices of drugs. at all. So, yeah, through medicalization in the hands of doctors, the drugs would be a lot cheaper and will bring up all these things.
Okay, so this kind of ties into what you were saying about like bankrupting illegal drug dealers and all that. Now, is the long-term goal for this to kind of like de-incentivize and like phase out common widespread addiction, or is the plan to keep it at a steady and healthy level, if that makes sense? If you have people coming in for like drugs like cocaine or something, obviously there are other health effects that a drug like that might cause, even if it's in a controlled environment. Is the plan, like in the long term, to kind of phase these things out and provide people with other options and stuff?
Not on an individual basis, but on like a societal basis. See, I'm not sure if we can phase out drugs and people will keep getting addicted to them. Ideally, people will never have access to these drugs in the first place and necessarily get addicted and be able to handle their mental health through better ways. But that kind of goes back to societal's first question about how do we keep addiction overall? This, I would like it if we had no substance use problems in America, and any substance use alcoholism and opioids, even though but alcoholism is completely legal. We never were really able to phase it out. I guess I don't think we can do that. I think just keeping people stabilized. I'm not as concerned with the drug use rate overall. I'm more concerned with the stabilized addict. Can these addicts have a happy family life, happy social life, and a happy work life? If these people are thriving in life and able to keep a healthy relationship, but they need to take heroin in order to do that, then I'm not overly concerned with them taking heroin. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think it just kind of, you hear a lot of discussion about how people, society, government, whatever, should treat drug addiction not as a criminal epidemic, but like a medical crisis or something like that. And I've just heard people kind of talk about this stuff. Obviously you're not going to be able to eliminate drug use, but it's just kind of interesting seeing in what way. Because, as a medical institution, you want to keep things as safe and best for the patients possible. So it's just kind of interesting exploring that.
So,
thank you.
So you gave a couple of examples where folks have tried this and so on in certain ways, and it seemed like that John Mark guy, whatever he was going on there. Was he a doctor? Was he?
Yes.
Okay. So I think the next question for me would be, all right, so if we're going to legally, medically prescribe a substance that you're addicted to, that you have a dependency on, that was really interesting, where those dependencies come from, but that's beside the point. Was beside this point. So one, who prescribes, who or how is addiction diagnosed? In other words, I'm just seeing somebody looking for a loophole here, right? Again, if it's my addiction that is the illness that I need to be prescribed heroin for, who gets to determine that diagnosis? Who gets to determine the what's the word I'm looking for? The prescription level, and I think an augmented to that question would be is the end goal for the individual patient to scale them off of that? Have you seen that in the cases that you mentioned?
Well, as I mentioned, so with natural recovery, so I don't think they went into that much detail who, I think it's I'm pretty sure just psychologists, physical general health physicians are probably competent to prescribe drugs as needed. I remember before prohibition of drugs, even in America, they were research I did, they didn't specify what type of doctors they were just doctors, and doctors would give out medication drugs for addiction before, and problems came around one of the people without being able to be treated for their addiction. So can you repeat your question like one more time for me?
So basically it was just like, who and how, and if this is like into the technical part of the medical side of it, that's fine. But I'm just wondering, like, who gets to say this person is addicted versus okay, so something that, as you were explaining that, something that came to mind when cannabis dispensaries, marijuana dispensaries started popping up. Originally, the idea was you had to have some sort of medical, like whether it's anxiety or I know glaucoma was one that was kind of like thrown around a lot. That you have this medical condition, and so you're allowed to have some weed. You know, basically was the bottom line for a lot of people, and so you ended up having a lot of whether or not they actually have this condition was really kind of like they were finding steps around it. So that's what's behind this. Like,
Okay.
who gets to say this person is addicted? How do we define that exactly? And then the second part of the question was, okay, once we have someone that is addicted, who is addicted, how do we scale them down off of that, or do we at all?
So I think there are some ways to like help somebody's addicted. Now, think that how do you know if your doctor's pushing like that's like too far into the medical side.
Right.
I didn't really look at that. But like, as when they John Mark's hospital, people came in with like abscess like in them, like they had concrete powder in them.
Yeah, that's pretty evident. Yeah.
I mean, people don't usually put concrete powder in them. It sounds for fun.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that would be a good sign of addiction.
Right.
Like, I'm not qualified enough, but like, I'm sure like psychologists who probably tell addiction, like, maybe like, do like multiple, like, dinner meetings or of course like multiple days, and like, yeah. But
No, that's fair. That's a fair
I just
answer.
don't
Yeah.
know what my place
Sure,
anymore.
yeah.
I'm more like this to settle. I'm kind of in this presentation, so yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Good answer.
Any question I need to answer, or is that?
Well, like, I was more interested if in these cases that I think you said Portugal.
Yeah.
It was on a little bit, and then in other cases, did you have instances where, or did you see? Again, I'm just like pulling out a thread is all.
Yeah.
Did they give these drugs to folks in like incrementally smaller amounts? Like, are we weaning people off of them?
So I think the point of medicalization is to make so I think in the John Mark's hospital, because I think was most seen at his protocol was more of just to be decriminalization, so it's not as like it's a bit more open than legalization. But in John Mark's hospital, we had the idea of a stabilized addict. So the idea is that I will eventually go through this process of natural recovery, in which eventually they would just stop taking the drug after like he's like 10 or so years. And some people never go through that process, but like that's one of the exceptions as a rule. The idea is the idea of giving people drugs, like giving them enough until they're stabilized. So the stabilized addicts are people who like can have like healthy relationships like with like family, friends, and work. And like the idea is giving people like a good life, not necessarily getting people off of drugs. Like, no one's being hurt. Like, who was hurt by somebody taking heroin and having healthy family lives, healthy friend lives, and healthy work lives? Like, who was hurt in that situation? Well,
and I think that's where I was driving at was like, for most of these instances, the substance itself is harming the addict. Like heroin is a very taxing substance on a person's body. Cocaine more so, or at least as much so. You know, in terms of life expectancy, in terms of, you know, and this is in the case that there's a reason why, you know, they don't use these medically, you know, that because they may use different strains or different amounts and so on, but you know, a lot of these, and I guess that's what was behind my question was, are we looking to, like you said, to stabilize a person in their addiction, or are we trying to wean them from the addiction?
We're trying to keep them like long. We're trying to ultimately wean them off of their addiction, but this is trying to like stabilize long enough for them to wean themselves off of it. Like most times they will do it themselves.
Right.
So like it's like stabilizing until they wean off, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting that in a lot of those studies that you were talking about, and you wrote about a couple more in your paper, I remember, but it's interesting that it's not even so much about like incremental dosage or anything like that. It's just whenever the dependency isn't the environment, what's the term I saw? The environmental instigation of needing this drug, once that's taken off, you're right, like in a lot of these cases, they naturally need it less and less.
Yeah, most of the time, I should have mentioned this, but it just hit me now, it's like accidents, like, yeah, most of the time, like, people don't, like, these addicts, they don't have to be prescribed as much each time, they just take less and less each time. Yeah, so I forgot to mention that.
No, and that's super promising. That's a really good aspect of all this, yeah.
Yeah, so so it's kind of like, they stabilize them and wean them off, they're going to wean themselves off over time, so you kind of stabilize them at each point where they're weaning off. Does that make sense?
No, yeah.
Okay.
Makes sense. I'm sorry, we're just chatting away up here. Anybody else have any comments, input, anything you'd like to share?
Alright. If you like take away like the stigma and the fear factor around drugs, is that not like normalize like entry level drugs? Like people live these like happy lives and happy jobs and relationships, then does that not like kind of make people like think that taking drugs is normal? Maybe more people would.
I haven't really seen like any like sources saying that. I mean, like in Portugal, like when the drugs were decriminalized, there was an increase in experimental drug use, but if people only use like the drug like once or twice in their life, there's not going to be any long-term harm to it. And right now, with like decriminalization, there is a lot of long-term harm. So I mean, that's a trade-off. Like, sure, drug using might increase a little bit, but there shouldn't be like much harm done. Like as a result, like should be much like relational or societal harm done by it. Just like experimental, like once or twice they use. Yeah.
I don't know if you studied like in Portugal, but like for like experimental drug use, like they use it once. So like if a lot of it is like biological, don't you think that they would like keep on using it? And like once you get that first high, that chase after.
Right. Yeah. So like that was for like decriminalization. So like it's gonna be kind of like a choice question. Like it's gonna be hard for people to just stumble upon like these addictive drugs anyway. They have to be addicted to get them in the first place. But like with like genetics, like it's just like a risk factor, it's not necessarily a cause. Like in my research, I've seen that addiction is in people who both have like a risk factor for it and are also met with a cause for it. And if they only just have like the risk of genetics without having like the cause of the traumatic like environment, like if they're in a supportive community and they're happy, they don't want to numb. Like drugs are often used to like numb the pain, and they don't have any pain to numb, then they will end up using it.
All good questions. It's a big issue. Anything else? All right. Thank you, Erin.